Okay, so I just want to start us off because we're in week one here and talking about poetry. It might have been some time since you've read poetry or written poetry or anything like that, or maybe you've never really had much experience with that, and that's totally fine. But we're going to be taking it week by week. We're going to look at as many different types of poems as we can, even some of the older ones that we're going to go back to sort of look at the roots of them and compare them and see the progression. I always think before we even get into looking at some of our reading for this week, it's really good to, look at a poem and think about some questions you want to ask yourself. So, poetry is sometimes really, really intimidating. I know back even when I was in grade school, high school, and I would see a poem or we cover a poetry unit, I think, at first glance, is it bad or is it wrong if I always don't understand what the poem is saying? And that's okay because what we learn through writing is that, writing is much more than what is simply in front of us. That whether we're reading fiction writing, prose writing, nonfiction, essays, poetry, lyrics, it doesn't matter. We're still going to always have to read deeper and read to find meaning for ourselves and to really find meaning for other people. So I'm thinking that whatever level experience we're going to talk about coming in with poetry, sort of, envision it as a clean slate and starting off fresh and opening your mind and perspective to really what could come. So I love this because poetry can be formal or informal. It could be serious. It could be funny. It could be complex and difficult or simple on the surface with lots of subtle meanings in the background. Um, I love the idea of making sense of poetry, and when you can find something to say about a poem, it can help you refine your powers of observation. It just makes you more aware of the people, the things, the places, the objects, nature, your senses, everything around you. And the thing is, too, with a poem, you're not prescribed to a certain length or format or function. Poetry comes in so many, many different forms. So, if it's intimidating and you're thinking, how do I even start looking at some of these poems? How am I going to even start writing about some of these poems? That might seem even more intimidating to you. I always say start simple with any type of writing, and poetry makes no exceptions. When you're first going through poetry, start very basic. Start with literally what's in front of you. What is the title of the poem? What is the first line? What does that look like? What is the last line? What are their similarities? What are their differences? What images do I notice? So when I read this, if I have a visual, if I close my eyes, what is coming to my mind? Do I have anything that's really evoked by my senses? Can I see something very vividly? Can I hear something? Can I get the sense of taste or smell or a sensation or a feel? And when I put all these things together, can I link these images? Are they similar? Do some images repeat? Or does the images make me think of different feelings, emotions? Like, how do I feel when I read through this poem? Does it make me angry or sad or happy or a mix of all of these things? I also want to think about a couple other questions that come up, and I would move on to these sort of next that what kind of information does the poem give you about who's speaking or sort of the persona that's speaking? Does it actually say where the person is? Do we know any biographical details, age, gender, ethnicity, anything about religion or sexual orientation or gender, marital status, health, etc.? What is the person doing? Is there an action? Is there feeling? Is it just thinking? Is it more abstract? What information does the poem give you about the world, if anything? Or what does the speaker seem to be concerned about? Now, I'm giving you all these questions to think about here. You will never be able to answer every single one of these questions within a poem, but surely maybe with your first approach to a poem, some of these might come to your mind. I also like to look physically at the poem. Like, how is it arranged? We're going to talk about, is it arranged in stanzas? Are these stanzas a regular length or do they vary? Is one 4 lines and 3 and 4 and 3, or do they have distinct patterns? How long are the lines? What are the number of words or the syllables in there? What's the range between the shortest and the longest line? But how does the poet end sentences? Do they end at the end of lines, or do they wrap around and they end in the middle of a line? What people most commonly associate and think about when they hear poetry is rhyme. But poems don't have to rhyme, but do they rhyme? And if they do, are there any patterns that you can see with rhythm, repeated words, or lines? And how would you describe these? You have to read poetry out loud. You will hear, I think you should read any form of writing out loud, but particularly what parts of the language come alive. Are they lyrical, musical? Do any words hold greater emphasis? If you had written this poem, what would be your motivation? Why would you have written it? Or why do you think the author has written the poem too? I also think to look what's sort of the weirdest or strangest or even most confusing or mysterious part of a poem. It's okay to say you don't understand part of a poem. It's okay to say that you're not sure what something means. It's better to say that you don't know what something means rather than assume or just sort of sit out in the darkness. Do you notice any repetitions or emphases of concept or image, compare, contrast? A poem might have certain images of light or brightness or dark and light, sound and silence. So you might see something in that kind of pattern. If you're still unsure about some of the wording, choose some of the words from the poem that seem like they're important, especially if they're repeated or it's something that you don't know their meaning. You want to study their etymology. You want to study where they came from. It's okay to look up words. I think we get into that sort of mindset that it's a weakness to have to look up something or to ask. But with all the online references, you can look up a word literally without leaving your Word document. So make sure to do that when you're looking at poems. Now, these are just some questions to ask. These are certainly not inclusive of all questions that you will ask, but I think these are some good basic places to start when thinking about a poem. I'm going to put this document up in its format, and you have these notes also to go along as I'm reading them through with you, just as we approach our first week and thinking about poetry in its whole self.